In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Genesis 1:2. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Genesis 1:3. This was the first act of divine order breaking the silence of the void. Light, created by a mere word. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. Genesis 1:4. Day and night were born. On the second day, God created the sky and separated the waters above from the waters below. Genesis 1:6-8. On the third day he gathered the waters and let dry ground appear. He called the dry ground land and the gathered waters seas. Genesis 1:9-10. Then the land produced vegetation, plants bearing seeds and trees bearing fruit. Genesis 1:11-12. On the fourth day, God placed lights in the sky, the sun to govern the day, the moon and stars to govern the night. Genesis 1:14-19. On the fifth day, he filled the seas with living creatures and the skies with birds. Genesis 1:20-23. And on the sixth day, God created the animals that move along the ground. Genesis 1:24-25. But something greater was about to happen. God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." Genesis 1:26. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Genesis 2:7. Man became a living being, not just a creature, but a reflection of the divine. God planted a garden in Eden, a paradise filled with every beautiful and fruitful tree. Genesis 2:8-9. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone." Genesis 2:18. So he caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and from his side he made a woman. Genesis 2:21-22. The two were united and felt no shame. Genesis 2:25. But in that same garden, a choice was placed. The serpent, more cunning than any of the wild animals, deceived the woman. Genesis 3:1. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree? And so Eve took from the forbidden tree and ate. She gave some to Adam, and he also ate. Genesis 3:6. Then their eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked. Shame entered the story. Genesis 3:7. They heard God walking in the garden and hid. Genesis 3:8. But the Lord called to the man, "Where are you?" Genesis 3:9. It was not a question of location, but of heart. God knew. Still, he pursued them. Because even in failure, he is Father. Then God made garments of skin for Adam and Eve and clothed them. Genesis 3:21. A sacrifice was made. Blood was shed. And there, in the first act of redemption, a promise was spoken. God said to the serpent, "He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Genesis 3:15. This was the first prophecy of the Redeemer. Even in judgment, God planned redemption. Humanity was cast out of Eden, but not cast away from God's plan. Generations passed. The world was filled with violence, and God sent a flood. Genesis 6:11-13. But he preserved Noah, a righteous man, and made a covenant through him. Genesis 6:9, Genesis 9:9. After the waters receded, a rainbow appeared, the symbol of God's promise. Genesis 9:13. Then came Abraham, called to leave everything and walk by faith. Genesis 12:1. To him God said, "Look at the sky and count the stars, so shall your offspring be." Genesis 15:5. Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, each generation carrying the promise and yet revealing the brokenness of man. Joseph was betrayed, enslaved, forgotten in prison. Genesis 37:28, Genesis 39:20. But God was with him. He was lifted to power in Egypt and forgave his brothers. Genesis 41:41, Genesis 50:20. What man intended for evil, God intended for good. Genesis 50:20. Genesis is not just the beginning of the world. It is the beginning of grace, of purpose, of the divine plan to restore humanity. In the beginning, God created, and today He is still creating hope, creating life, creating new beginnings in hearts that turn back to Him.